Tonight's guest is a good friend of mine who has been a supporter of our work, and Chip Conley, if you don't know, is the founder of the Joie de Vie hotel chain, which I believe is the second largest boutique hotel chain in the United States. But more than just a hotel chain, through its evolution and development, I think Chip, who is actually a Stanford alumnus and business school alumnus, has also incorporated what he has learned in terms of corporate lessons through that experience, I think, and really brought that to bear into who he is in his life, and also to share those lessons with the larger community. He's written a few books. One is called Peak, and it's how great companies can get their mojo from Maslow. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And
all because of Phil Zimbardo here.
I was just going to say, so Phil Zimbardo in the audience is probably one of the most famous people in the world. And he's modest and humble. But believe it or not, he's right here. He's been a great supporter of our work. So Chip also has written more recently a book called Emotional Equations, with a foreword by Richard Branson. Or no, that was the other Peak.
That was the Rebel Rules.
Oh, okay. Well, you know, how many people write so many books that? But Emotional Equations was a New York Times bestseller. We're going to talk about that a bit. And so Chip has been on this journey. He's, through his lessons in life, through his experience, through who he is, it's really educated a whole group of people. And it really comes down to kindness, caring, and being thoughtful. And that's really why he's here today. We're going to have hopefully a nice conversation. It may turn into a brawl, I don't know yet. But well, that's only happened once or twice. Don't worry. But the other thing we're going to talk about, which is really going to be fun, is Chip is now on this quest to go to how many festivals in what period of time?
Well, I'm going to 40 festivals this year in 25 countries, but there'll be 300 festivals overall. Can
you imagine? So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So if you would please give a warm welcome to Chip Conley. Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
No notes.
You know. No, that's the extent of my notes.
I'm like Sarah Palin. I have like 3 things in my hand. So if you see me go. Well, welcome. So one of the parts of what we do during these things is, and what interests me actually a lot, is we know part of your story, but really what drives a lot of people is even further back, either their childhood, life experiences, or transformational events that put you in the position to perhaps learn some of the lessons you've learned.
Sure. And
maybe you could tell us about that.
Okay. We're going to plumb the depths of my childhood. I did do that here. Actually, when I was at Stanford, there was a point where I think it was my junior year of college. I was sort of on, I don't think I was depressed exactly, but I was definitely searching and a little bit lost, and I did end up with Dr. somebody Dorison, forgot his first name, who was very helpful. So in terms of going back to my childhood, I was a very introverted kid, and I had a Marine captain father. We shared the same name. I'm Stephen Townsend Conley Jr. He's senior, and the oldest son. He went to Stanford, so did my mom. They met here. And I love my parents. Had them over for dinner earlier this week. And
if you have your parents to dinner, apparently that qualifies.
I guess But it was very clear at a young age that I was a different kid than the kid that at least my father wanted. I was a great athlete. He wanted that. I was definitely good in school. But I was a little weird, introverted, creative. I had imaginary friends. And I remember when I was 12 years old that I said to my dad, I want to be a writer when I grow up. And my dad said, writers are either poor or psychotic, and most are both. I didn't know what psychotic meant, but I actually went to the dictionary and thought, oh, okay, wow. So I didn't think I wanted to be a writer when I was in my teen years because I thought it was the thing. It was not an appropriate thing to do. What was funny is ultimately I took a path that was very much my father's path for me, all the way through Stanford Business School. I went Stanford undergrad. My major was economics. I didn't enjoy it. My minor was studio art. I spent a lot of time down the way here and preferred that. I was accepted straight into Stanford Business School as an undergrad, which is pretty odd. And then Stanford Business School is really where I had my awakening that I can be a rebel. But I will say that one of the most formative experiences for me growing up that helped me to understand what compassion was about was in my junior high school, and especially in my high school. I went to a place called Long Beach Poly High School. Anybody familiar with it or heard of it? Yeah, Long Beach Poly High School. It's where Snoop Dogg went to high school a few years after me. But I was called the Curious White Boy. And that was my name. It was not Chip Conley. It was Curious White Boy. And it was partly because I was fascinated by the bouillabaisse of cultures that were in my high school. I loved it. I felt, for the first time in my life, having grown up in an environment where my neighborhood was predominantly white, very white middle class, Southern California, Long Beach, California kind of experience. And then I had this junior high school and high school experience in an intensely multicultural environment, and I was the other. I was the minority. And it was so liberating because what it helped me to see, yes, there was compassion to understand other people, but actually, in some ways, when I was in the predominantly white, tough guy kind of elementary school and most of part of junior high school, I really felt like there was a role I was supposed to play, and I had to sort of live within very prescribed limits. But when I was the other in high school, I was a minority. I started to realize how much I could break out of what was defined as the predominant or majority kind of way of being. And it also is part of the flavor of why I'm going around the world to experience all the world's best festivals now, which we'll talk about in a little while. But I love the idea of being culturally curious. I think being culturally curious is what's going to save the world, and I think it's what's going to actually create a robust life for ourselves. So the roots of that really came from my experience at Long Beach Poly High School.
It's interesting when you talk about sort of being a minority. I think the other thing is, if you've lived in a predominantly white environment, it's really hard to understand what others who potentially feel as if they're in the out group really feel. And it's interesting, I lived in Hawaii for a while. And there...
You're a haole.
I'm a haole, yes. And there, in some ways, you can feel like actually a minority in certain environments. And it's an experience that all of us should have because, there's certain things and interactions, I think, that we take for granted.
Yeah.
But when you suddenly become in that environment and you see certain prejudices, you see how certain types of people treat you, it's an amazing, enlightening experience, and I think it causes you to take pause at how you actually interact sometimes and don't even appreciate it. And I'd written a thing in a blog actually about an interaction like that. If any of you are interested, you can track that down. But it certainly for me was an interesting experience. So did you have brothers and sisters?
I had two younger sisters, and I came to Stanford. I was in a fraternity here. I played on the Stanford water polo team. I was I was an athlete. I was all these different things. And it was when I went overseas, my junior year, to Clifton, the English campus at the time, that I had this reckoning that I'd spent the last few years absolutely trying to live up to my dad's perspective of what I was supposed to be. And it took me a couple of years to really shift. I came back to the end of my junior year and started taking mushrooms up near the dish a lot. That was fun.
That hasn't changed.
I don't do that anymore. But back then, it sort of opened my mind. And long story short, I did go to Stanford Business School, and between my first and second year of business school in New York, working for Morgan Stanley wearing suspenders, that was when I came out as a gay man. And not in Morgan Stanley. That was not easy to do. But I would go and do my very straight, conservative, white bread investment banking during the day, and then go out down to Greenwich Village at nighttime. And it was when I really realized, okay, it's nice to be, my experience of being the other in high school helped me to feel comfortable being the other at age 22 when I was coming out. And it was hard with my Marine captain father, because he wanted me to be president of the United States by the time I was 35. But what was helpful for me, again, it was another moment of both liberation to just be myself and understanding what it means to be the other again. And to me, there's a German philosopher, Schopenhauer, who I think said, compassion is the basis for all morality. And what I hear in that, compassion is the basis for all morality, is for us to have compassion. I mean, I have two thoughts on compassion I'll just say quickly, and I probably have a lot more, but I'll start with these. Compassion, when you have compassion, it is easier to be moral. It's easier to be fair. It's easier to understand the other person's point of view. And so I think I think it makes sense that there's sort of foundational for having a moral society. But beyond that, one of the things that has been very clear to me over time around the issue of compassion is it's about judgment. To me, the opposite of compassion would be judgment. And my personal experience, both in seeing how difficult and judgmental I can be toward myself, but also seeing it in other people, especially as the CEO of a company that started with one person, me, and grew to now over 5,000 employees. What I could see is that when someone was judgmental of themselves, when they had a natural tendency toward personal judgment, even if it wasn't evident to other people or themselves, those were the people who had the hardest time with compassion. And so for me at age 22, having to come to grips with the fact, yeah, I am not what my dad expected. I'm not Stephen Townsend Conley Jr. the way my dad wanted me to be, but I am who I am. And to steal a phrase from Harvey Firestein, thank you. I've got my little gay contingent over here.
Actually, it's all over.
Yeah, probably. So learning how to be less judgmental of myself first was the key that unlocked the door of learning how to be more compassionate toward other people.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I think the science has shown that, you look at the work of Kristen Neff and others, in the West we're very judgmental of ourselves and self-critical, and until you can love yourself, or at least respect yourself, or allow yourself to be who you are, you can't be authentic. I mean, that's the challenge. When you can't be authentic, then you're putting up barriers to connection, and then of course everything falls apart after that. And I think it's a challenge for so many people. Yeah. In fact, some of you may have seen, and Phil always harangues me because I start talking about certain issues that are personally either painful or have had an impact on me, and my voice may start cracking up, and Phil will go, okay, how many times are we going to have this during this conversation? But when you do that, actually, what happens is it resonates with everybody, because that's what everybody wants to be, right? You want to be able to be in a conversation with somebody who in that interaction they're being authentic, versus giving you a presentation of something that's not necessarily their true selves. And whether you're hiding the fact or not coming to grips with the fact that you may be gay, or you have other issues that you feel uncomfortable about being out there with, it has a profound impact on how one interacts. In fact, sometimes I talk about wounds of the heart, and this is this idea where all of us have painful things that happen in our lives, and for most of us, we all get over them. But when you have something that is profoundly, deeply painful, and you've never had resolved, it continues to cause you pain. And all the problems I think we see in the world are manifestations of this. When you're in pain in your heart and you haven't resolved issues, it impacts how you interact in your daily life.
No doubt about it.
And there you have it. And I think ultimately it takes a lot of courage and a lot of self-reflection and frankly a lot of pain and suffering before you can get to that, that point. So I share with you the story of my older brother actually, if you will, came out of the closet when he was 14. And in my situation, my parents were at least fairly conservative in regard to that aspect of a human's life. And it was extraordinarily painful. And you know, I sort of watched this pain from afar, and it was hard. It was hard to watch. Certainly, it was harder at that time to live. So, so now you've just had dinner with them. So obviously, perhaps.
Well, you know, it took a while, but they embraced it. And actually, one of my two sisters is a lesbian. So we were the Brady Bunch. We were just, the classic Southern California ranch home style family with the Ford Fairlane station wagon with the wooden panel on the side with the AAA guide driving to Grand Canyon. That was, you saw us, and we didn't fit. What happened was basically their image of their three kids. My other sister's a bit of a rebel. She lives in Santa Cruz.
Enough said.
Enough said. So the three kids ended up not being the way they wanted them to be, but they came to love us for who we are.
Well, and I'm sure they're very proud.
Yeah.
But it is interesting how many of us try to model ourselves on expectations of what others want us to be,
sure,
not who we want to be. And again, that's a challenge of trying to be authentic with yourself. So tell me about the brothel that you bought when you were
Well, yeah. So I guess it was a brothel. So I went to Stanford Business School. I graduated. What I knew from that Morgan Stanley experience was that I didn't want to wear suspenders and smoke cigars for a living, which is what that felt like. I wanted to work for an entrepreneur, sort of a pioneering place. I wanted to work for a pioneer who allowed me to be creative. And I wanted to sort of use that studio art background a little bit somehow. Well, I went to work for a guy named Bill Poland who had gone to the business school, and he had a real estate development company in the city that was pretty maverick. But still, it was way too conservative for me. And so a couple years after graduating from Stanford Business School, I started my own company. I started a hotel company. I had no hotel experience. I was 20. It was my 26th birthday. And I started a company, and I called it Joie de Vivre. And the reason I called it Joie de Vivre was because I wanted the mission statement of the company, Joy of Life, to be also the name of the company. And the first hotel we bought, because I didn't have a lot of money, and I went out and raised about $1 million, but you can't buy a hotel in San Francisco for $1 million. In most neighborhoods, so in 1986, 1987, I bought this place called the Caravan Lodge. Anybody ever stay at the Caravan Lodge before I bought it in it actually closed escrow on New Year's Eve, 1986? Nobody's admitting it. You wouldn't admit it either.
No, I was going to say, actually, I may have, because my brother lived in the city during that time, and I would visit him, and the only money I had was to stay in, it wasn't a seedy hotel, but to stay in a seedy hotel.
It wasn't seedy. It's not even a seedy hotel, it's a seedy motel.
Yeah.
It was a no-tell motel.
Oh, now you rented rooms by the hour.
It was a place that rented rooms. Was I not
correct in my statement?
It was very busy at lunchtime, and it didn't have a restaurant. So that sort of describes the place.
But there was a lot on the menu.
But it was actually in bankruptcy when I bought it. It was in bad shape, and it had seen better days. And I called it the Phoenix, like the mythological bird rising from the ashes, and decided that the core market we were going to go after was rock and roll bands, because the Marriott and the Hilton didn't want them. And who else would stay in a motel in the Tenderloin? And as it turns out, it wasn't just sort of rock and roll bands. We got lots and lots of famous musicians, artists, filmmakers. It became this crossroads for the creative. And sort of helped. It was one of the earlier hotels in the boutique hotel market in the US. And taught me that my creative instincts, my dad wanted to call the place Magnolia Court, and of course, he wanted to advertise in the AAA guidebook. He thought families like ours were going to stay there. No, I said, you know, we're going to call it the Phoenix. It's a rock and roll hotel. We're going to advertise. We're going to market to the tour managers who take the bands on the road because they're usually 4 or 5 years older than the rest of the male musicians. They're the ones who are like the babysitters. And we're going to tell those tour managers when they come to town, if they get 10 room nights, which is like 5 rooms times 2 nights, we'll give a free massage, legitimate massage, not like the old school massages that went on there, a legitimate massage for free. If you bring, and as it turns out, they all brought their bands, and it became a big success. And that was the first of 52 boutique hotels I created over 26 years. The last one I'm doing, because I sold a majority of the company to somebody else, and to a guy named John Pritzker. His father started Hyatt. And so my last hotel is in downtown Palo Alto. It's so wonderful because it's like taking it right back here. And it's going to be called the Epiphany. It's at the corner of Hamilton and Emerson. It was for many, many years the Casa Olga, and it was an assisted living center, actually for people who were really down on their luck in many ways. And then the state cut off funding, so all those people had to leave, and then it was empty, and then they had some month-to-month people, and then they decided to do an 80-year lease with us to create a boutique hotel in Palo Alto, in downtown Palo Alto. So I love my last, hurrah is right here in the backyard.
Wow, that's how big is it?
It'll be 86 rooms. It's 8 stories tall. I mean, Palo Alto is very hard to build in downtown Palo Alto, but it's got beautiful views, and yeah, it'll be great. It opens in December. So. And Rob Steinberg is right there, is Palo Alto architect. It's the architect of the project.
Wonderful.
So yeah.
That sounds exciting.
Yeah.
Speaking of the hotel, you made a comment one time, and you used an early employee, the woman from Vietnam.
Vivian, yeah.
And again, I think, and I want you to tell you the story, but it shows you, though, that every one of us can learn something from everyone.
Yeah, it's
and somehow thinking that you have to come to an illustrious institution like Stanford to learn about life and reality and how to be a better person is really a myth, I think.
Yeah, if I had to say what a CEO does, if they do their job well, is they're not the chief executive officer, they're the chief emotions officer. And I think the number one thing I learned in the 24 years of being CEO of my company was how to understand my own emotions and those of other people. And Vivian has worked with me for 26 years at the Phoenix. She was there. I inherited her. She had started in a job as a housekeeper there at the hotel 2 weeks before I bought the place. She was newly from Vietnam. And what I learned over the course of time with Vivian was something that Abe Maslow taught me, not personally. He died in 1970. Although I will tell you, for those of you who don't know it, Abe Maslow, some of his last years of his life, he was on Sand Hill Road, working for the Saga Corporation as sort of the in-house psychologist to look at how to apply his hierarchy of needs for the individual, but for the collective. And then he unfortunately died at age 62 in 1970 before he really was able to communicate about how to apply the idea of the hierarchy of needs to organizations. So in some ways, what I felt as part of my role in life is to channel Abe Maslow. And part of the way I channeled Abe with respect to Vivian was I started to really see that if there's a pyramid for employees in a company, Abe had 5 levels, but let's distill it down to 3, based upon survival, succeed, and transformation. Survive, succeed, transform. Money, recognition, and meaning. To me, no matter what kind of job you're in, that's sort of the pyramid. Money, which really speaks to someone having a job. Recognition, which speaks to someone having a career. And meaning, which speaks to someone having a calling. And what I learned from Vivian was she didn't have a calling because she was cleaning toilets for a living, because that's what housekeepers do. It's one of many tasks that they do. She had a calling because she felt like she was the mom away from home, or she was the mom for people who are away from home, and she was there to help people who are vulnerable on the road feel like their room that they came back to after being out for the day was a tranquil place. And she told me that she was the peace of mind police. She was the peace of mind police. And especially in the Tenderloin, for someone staying in a motel in the Tenderloin, a rock and roll hotel with all these different bands, people would come back to their room, and she wanted it to be a peaceful, tranquil place. And she loved the relationship she created with our guests as well as with the other employees, the other housekeeping staff especially. So what it really taught me was, okay, how do we create meaning? Most leaders in organizations, if they're trying to evaluate, are their employees happy? If you get an employee satisfaction survey, usually the company or the organization will be judging you or asking you questions about, is your pay fair? Do you like your benefits? Maybe they'll ask, is your boss friendly to you? They may ask some things like that. But they rarely ask, what's your sense of meaning? Or how does this job make you feel in life? One of the things we've gotten very good at in the last 10 or 15 years is to be able to measure the environmental footprint, the carbon footprint that companies have in the world. Part of my role today, and part of what I do with my books, is I'm helping people to measure not the environmental footprint, but the emotional fist print that most organizations have on their people. And what I mean by emotional fist print, I mean the toxic environment that tends to occur in many organizations that in some cases brutalizes people, but in other cases creates apathy and a certain learned helplessness, which is usually a first step toward depression. So what I saw in speaking with Vivian and really building a relationship where, at least once a year we'd have a lunch together, and sometimes it would be 2 or 3 days. In the early days, it was every month. But later, when we had 40, 50 hotels, I'd still go to lunch with her and just listen to her, is I learned that when you help people find that you've got the job and the money, the compensation, when that's figured out and people feel fair about that and they're able to pay their rent or their mortgage, they do want that recognition. But at the end of the day, what really gives people that sense of inspiration and the sense of meaning is when they feel like there's a purpose in the organization that they can get behind, that they really are proud of, and that they realize on a regular basis their impact on that purpose. So I was lucky enough to be asked to go speak at the TED conference. I look at Phil because I see Phil at the TED conference on occasion 3 years ago to talk about Vivian, to talk about what I learned from Vivian and what I learned about from the King of Bhutan, because I went to Bhutan in 2009 to study their gross national happiness index. Because speaking of pyramids, like we in the US and around the world have gotten very good at measuring GDP. But GDP in some ways is the bottom of the pyramid. And what I wanted to understand is how did a little Buddhist country wedged in between India and China 40 years ago start measuring happiness? And now there are over 60 countries in the world, not including this one, that measure happiness as a metric for success for the government. So I spent a week over there. And what I was able to learn from a king of a country and a maid in a motel was it's all about how do we start learning how to measure and manage what really counts in life, or how do we count what really counts, and how do we count what's higher up the pyramid, to use the Maslow metaphor, or meta, yeah.
For some of you who may not know, CCARE is doing a conference at the end of April on business and compassion, and Chip has been kind enough to agree to participate. One of the interesting things when you think about this issue of business, and it's interesting you use the analogy of the fist, the cost of, if you will, the fist approach in business I mean, if you look at the numbers or the estimates, it's $200 to $300 billion a year is the cost, if you will, for not putting happiness at the highest part of someone's job, or at least transformation, or buying into the mission. Because what happens to a lot of people, it's hard to function if you have fear.
That's right.
If a company creates an environment of fear, it leads to anxiety. Anxiety leads to paralysis in the context of, if you will, your executive function. It leads to poor decision making.
You go to your fight or flight part of your brain. It's the amygdala hijack. And when you're, I'm sorry to interrupt, but when you're...
I'm really pissed.
Okay. you got a little amygdala hijack going on right there. Yeah, no, so I think that what I wanted to just say, because it was perfect timing with what you said, was that what was so reassuring. So I gave my TED Talk in February of 2010, and it was well received, and I really appreciated it. In January, February of 2012, the Harvard Business Review, which is about as conservative, old school establishment of a business journal as it comes, had a happy face on the cover of the January issue, and the whole issue was dedicated to the value of happiness. And what they were able to show is that empirically, in 6 different studies, 6 different great academics who'd written articles, that happiness leads to success. The opposite is not always true. Success does not always lead to happiness. And in the context of an organization, there's a lot of evidence that shows that happiness does drive success. So,
yeah. So, sort of this continuing to add on to the statement is this issue that about anxiety and fear and paralyzing, because you look at the issues of absenteeism. Some use the term presenteeism. You're at work, but you're not functional. Or you're angry because when you're anxious or in fear, you have 2 responses. One, you can be anxious. The other is you can be angry. And when you're angry, then you start trying to sabotage the company. And that creates a whole other set of issues. It's estimated the cost of these types of behaviors, whether it's in the context of employee turnover, whether it's in the context of decreased productivity, whether it's in the context of healthcare, it costs somewhere between $5,000 to $7,500 per employee. I mean, can you imagine the cost of that? We complain about healthcare costs. The healthcare cost of someone who is not happy, if you will, is almost 50 to 75% more than a person who doesn't have those stress. And in fact, we're doing some studies, some of the people who are engaged with CCARE, we look at the effects of these types of hijacking of the amygdala, if you will, or loss of executive control happens in the context of immune function, cortisol levels, all these other things. And on the long term, it has a profound impact. And to look at enlightened individuals who've created companies who actually have thought about that, I think we're perhaps about to see a sea change or a tipping point.
Yeah. But
I think you've certainly been a pioneer of that. And I think there are now many people who are getting an understanding of this. Jeff Weiner, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Jeff
LinkedIn, yep.
Is the CEO of LinkedIn, and he and I were just together a little bit ago. And, this has become his mission, and which is extraordinary, right? But to talk to people who now place this at the front of how they see the world and how they manage their business. And yes, you can, and it's interesting because we talk about the effect of ruthless type of behavior in the context of Darwin, and it may get you something on the short term, but I think you know as well as I do that it's kindness and consideration and compassion that allows for you to reach your potential and have the best long-term survival, if you will.
I was very fortunate last week to be at the Esalen Institute. I'm on the board of the Esalen Institute down south of Big Sur, and we had John Mackey from Whole Foods Markets. Now, you may not agree with all of his politics, especially around healthcare, because he's extreme libertarian. But the company he's created, Whole Foods Market, is a model for, generally speaking, for a compassionate organization. And for the last 3 years in a row, John has brought together a collection of 20 CEOs at Esalen for a conscious business workshop there. And I've helped lead it, and so there are 20 of us there. And then the last 2 days, actually that was Sunday through Wednesday, and then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I led with Soren Gordhammer from Wisdom 2.0. We led with 17 CEOs under 40, the next generation. And what was so fascinating to see the older folks, which was the early part of the week, and I'm 52, so I fit that group, and then to see the younger folks. And the younger folks, some of these folks are running companies that are huge. One of the guys was one of the 3 founders of PayPal, and now has his own venture capital company. And another guy just at age 27 sold his company to Google and did extremely well. And so what was interesting is to just see the generational shift. What's wonderful about the collection of people who are the pioneers, the John Mackeys of the world, the Kip Tyndall of the world, that created the Container Store, the folks who started Patagonia. What's great is that they have been rebels on some level, and they have been advocates, but they have been, the other. Speaking of minority, they have been the other. They have not been the majority. What's so wonderful to see amongst MBAs today, and there's an organization called Net Impact, which is about MBAs who want to change the world. I speak at their conference almost every year. And to see these younger 17 CEOs, is for them, it's sort of like, duh. For them, it's like, this is the way you do business. There's a guy named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, known as Mike, who wrote the book Flow. And he said not long ago, or maybe 10 years ago, well, actually maybe it was 20 years ago, he wrote a book called Good Business. It's a great book, Good Business. And he said, you can tell who's powerful in a society based upon the size of the buildings. Clearly, this is a very male thing. And 100 years ago, 150 years ago maybe, the tallest buildings in any town or city were the cathedrals, the mosques, the temples, because the power rested with organized religion. 50 years ago, the tallest buildings in many cities were the city halls, state capitals, the governmental buildings. And today, what's very apparent, and is not just very apparent, but is actually in the DNA of the organizations being created by people 40 and younger today, is that the tallest buildings today in most communities are not the synagogues or the temples or the churches, and it's not the city halls. It's the skyscrapers. It's the office buildings. And what that says is the power rests in business. And what's wonderful to see is that the people who are there at Esalen, who are 25 and 30 and 35 and starting their companies, the question is not, oh, how do we do that CSR thing, that corporate social responsibility thing, as a sort of like something you bolt on to a business plan. Their corporate social responsibility is like imbued in everything they're doing. And they know, frankly, if they don't do that, they're not going to do very well in the marketplace. So it's a nice change. It is a sea change, and I think in the next 10 to 20 years, we'll see it a lot more noticeably. The number one thing I think that has to happen at a global or a governmental level to really help facilitate this is the tax system has to change such that we basically, if you're a public company, it's all about quarterly earnings, and the investors make their money based upon sometimes holding a stock for 4 hours. And we have a short-term capital gains and long-term capital gains, and we should have various tiers of capital gains based upon how long you hold a stock or how long you hold an investment. Because the shorter you hold it, it's not really an investment. It's like my no-tell motel. It's a short-term relationship. Very transactional. I don't think you understand what I meant, but
no, I saw one or two people here.
So it's not real investing. It's not real. So I think that we need to do that, because I think what we need to help public companies do is get over the sort of adrenaline rush of what are our quarterly earnings and how are we going to take short-term measures to maximize profits to help investors make money, which is all fine, except for a lot of times when you're doing things in a short-term basis, you're doing things transactionally, and you're not thinking consciously about the impact systemically of what you're doing.
You know, in that context, I think when that is the driver, then you get CEOs who that's how they're driven, right?
Yeah.
You know, you look at somebody like Buffett, who these are long-term investments,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
he's not looking at what happens next week or
Right.
next month. It's what's going to happen years from now. And obviously, he's been extraordinarily good at that. But that's the problem. When you are rewarded for the brief transaction,
Right.
that's what
It is a no-tell motel experience.
And we've seen disaster on multiple levels, right? Let's talk about how, you know, it's interesting you talk about the motel, the Alltel motel down in Palo Alto, and how that sort of brought you back to your roots. But the other thing you had said earlier was how you'd wanted to be a writer, and in some ways now you've gone back to that.
Yeah, well, yeah, being able, you know, I've written 4 books, started writing. The reason I started writing books was as I learned more about what it was like to be a CEO or an entrepreneur. I was lucky enough that people would ask me to give speeches, and by the time I was my mid to later 30s, we were the largest hotelier in the Bay Area. We had 21 hotels around the Bay Area by that time. And so I started giving speeches, and people would hear me talk, and they'd say, well, why don't you write a book? And well, so I said, oh, well, my dad said that. I'll become psychotic if that happens. But I wrote that first book called The Rebel Rules, Daring to Be Yourself in Business, and Richard Branson wrote the foreword to that. And I loved it. And what I started to realize is that my role one of my callings in life was not just starting this creative company, culture-driven company, but it was to actually learn, to be curious about life, and then learn from it, and then document it and express my wisdom along the way. Now, when I first did that, I tell you, some of the fellow CEOs I knew thought I was crazy because, like, wait, you're telling your secrets. And it's like, well, that's crazy. I mean, there are no secrets out there. I mean, there are secrets. There are secrets, especially in technology. But when it comes to operating and leadership and understanding emotions and emotional intelligence, you know, I don't think there are any secrets. It's all about how you operate and execute and how you show up, you know, authentically as a person. And so I can write it in a book, but that doesn't mean someone else is going to steal that emotional intelligence idea. So I started loving that. And then at some point, I started loving that a lot more than being a CEO. And that was when I had a really big challenge. And that ultimately led me to writing this book, Emotional Equations. I had a flatline experience on stage in St. Louis at age 47. Won't go into the details of it unless people want to ask in the Q&A. But it was a wake-up call for me to just realize I don't want to be doing this CEO thing anymore. I've been doing it for 22 years. It has gone from being a calling to being a job. And I wanted to go out and write and speak, and I wanted to go to Bhutan and study and learn. And I had no idea at the time, and I did figure out a way to, in the bottom of the Great Recession, to get my company out of some hot water and sell a majority interest to someone who could help it get to a better place as well. And it allowed me to graduate out of being CEO. And what I thought is I would just go write and speak and learn, and then I had this fascinating experience a year ago after Emotional Equations came out, and the book did really, really well. And it was sort of my story of how I used Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, as my savior in that hospital room.
How many people have read that book or aware of it?
Wow, great.
You know, it's so irritating that people come and they're so educated and enlightened already. We don't even...
Well, I think it's the best business book ever written.
Oh, no,
but it's not a business book, of course. And I'd read it before. What I loved about it when I read it before was it was like, wow, it was a secular book on meaning, and most books on meaning have a really strong religious tone to them. And I liked the fact that this had a very strong secular perspective in terms of how you can find meaning in life.
Maybe you could just comment for
those
who didn't, that's sort of the backstory there.
So backstory is Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychologist in Vienna in the 1930s. He had a theory called logotherapy, which was based upon the idea that what fuels us in life is meaning. how we find meaning. And those people who actually are able to find meaning are able to have a more robust life. I mean, it's not that dissimilar from Maslow's hierarchy of needs and self-actualization, but there were different perspectives. Ironically and tragically, he ended up in a concentration camp and got to test his theory about who lived and who didn't in the context of a concentration camp in World War II. All of his family died in different concentration camps, and he was in a separate one from his wife, and he saw who lived and who didn't. And what he learned from that experience is that meaning is the fuel of life, because it wasn't necessarily the people who were the most infirmed or sickly, who actually physically sickly, who died. It was the ones who gave up and had lost a sense of meaning in that moment and what this experience was going to be for them. He wrote his book, Man's Search for Meaning, when he got out of concentration camp, became a very famous book. I was reading that book, just take a back step for a second. I started reading that book in April of 2008. My flatline experience was in July of 2008. August of 2008. I started reading that book in April of 2008 because I was depressed. I was the CEO of a company I didn't want to be CEO of anymore, and I could see we'd gone through the dot-com bust, and we got through it and flourished. I could see this great recession was going to be a terrible downturn, because in the hotel business, we're like the canary in the coal mine. We start seeing the downturn faster than Walmart or McDonald's, because you're going to buy your deodorant or your Big Mac, maybe, hopefully, I guess.
I like to order you, your deodorant is more important than your Big Mac.
That's true.
That's an interesting...
But you stop paying for your hotel rooms. You stop doing that, or restaurants or spas. So I started reading the book. Then my friend, Chip, I have a friend, Chip Hankins, who was our insurance broker, and he was sort of my wisdom. He was my wisdom 2.0. He was our insurance broker, but he was such a wise guy, and we would read these books together, talk about what we were learning from Marcus Aurelius, or great books from long ago. And on April 30th, 2008, I was in St. Louis giving a speech on self-actualization, not feeling very self-actualized. It was about 6 months after Peak, the book about Maslow had come out, and I got a call on my cell phone right before I was going on stage from the CEO of Chip's insurance brokerage company telling me that Chip had committed suicide. And he was the first of 6 friends of mine in a 4-year period who committed suicide. And so it was hard. I mean, it was awful going on stage trying to give a speech when I didn't feel like I could talk about that. And the next month, he was in New Zealand. He and his wife and kids had moved to New Zealand. And the memorial service up here was in early June. It was really hard to go to. It's hard to go. This is the first of 5 other 6 memorial services I had to go to for friends who committed suicide. And this was the hardest one because it was the first, and he had the same name as I did, and he was the one who I thought was
most together.
Most together. And I was feeling quite depressed at the time myself, and people going up to stage giving their Chip stories, and I was like, it was hard. And a month later, I broke my ankle playing baseball at Gavin Newsom's bachelor party. And then it became a bacterial infection in my leg because I had fertilizer and a cut on my leg I didn't know about, and I almost had my leg amputated in Montana at Gavin Newsom's wedding. And then I came back on antibiotics, and I ended up in St. Louis to give this speech. In St. Louis again, that's where I found out about Chip, and I was on crutches and on antibiotics, and at the end of my speech, I had an antibiotic, probably an allergic reaction, and I went unconscious on stage, and then I went flatline. And I went flatline just as the paramedics arrived. And so for the next 90 minutes, I went flatline 9 times. That night, after the emergency room in the ICU, I was in my hospital room, and I said to the nurse, "Could you bring my briefcase over here?" And she wagged her finger at me like, "That's what got you in here in the first place." I said, "No, there's a book in there that I need to see. I think I brought this book that I just need to read," and it was Man's Search for Meaning. And that night, I spent most of the night up, and I sketched on a little piece of paper this equation that ultimately led me to writing this book called Emotional Equations that did really well. And it was despair equals suffering minus meaning. Despair equals suffering minus meaning. And what does that mean? Basically, at that point, I wanted to actually distill the most famous book on meaning, or secular book on meaning, into something that was actionable, that I could work on immediately. And what despair equals suffering minus meaning, because it's probably not a ton of math people in here, so let me explain the math on this. The sacred algebra is despair. So if despair, thinking of 8 equals 10 minus 2, right? 8 equals 10 minus 2. 8 despair, 10 suffering, 2 meaning. Well, if you're a good Buddhist, and I know there are a lot of good Buddhists in the room, suffering is the first noble truth of Buddhism. You don't have to be a good Buddhist to know that, but you know that, frankly, suffering is there if you want to look for it. It's just sort of ever-present. Once I sort of realized that suffering is ever-present, and I'd spent the last few months in a suffering state, constantly looking at what wasn't working, I said, okay, suffering is a constant, meaning is a variable, and meaning and despair are inversely proportional. You increase the meaning, the despair goes down. Math, 10 equals 8 minus 2. If 8 equals 10 minus 2.
The book is much better.
Yeah, if the meaning goes up, 2 goes to 4, the despair goes down. So I spent the next few months looking at how do I create meaning in my life as a CEO in a job I don't want. How do I create meaning for the people around me? 3 months later, there's a hotel called the Dream Inn. Used to be an awful hotel in Santa Cruz. Now it's nicer. It's still really way too expensive during the summer. But it's a hotel that we took over 5 years ago and renovated. We had our annual managers retreat, and I was facing 80 people in a room, and my senior executives told me to write a speech. This was November of 2008. And between August of 2008, when I had my flatline experience, and November of 2008, the economy didn't get any better. It got a lot worse. Lehman Brothers went bankrupt in September and just got worse and worse and worse. I started feeling better. Despair equals suffering minus meaning. On a weekly basis, I would make a list of what emotions I'd learned that week and how I was going to use authenticity or vulnerability or humility or courage next week in my role as a CEO and in my role as a human. And so I was supposed to go give this speech in front of 80 people to say, yeah, 2009 is going to be a great year. We're going to hit it out of the ballpark. And what I saw 5 minutes before I went on stage with my speech in my hand is that was bullshit, excuse me. And I'd learned a lot about authenticity in the last 3 months, as well as vulnerability. But I'd never told my story about going flatline to this group of people. And there was only about 6 people in the company who actually knew about it. And so I got up and I told my story. And then I went up to the easel and I wrote despair equals suffering minus meaning. And I said, in the next 60 to 90 minutes, we're going to find some collective meaning together. I'm not sure what we're going to do because I'm not going to give you a speech. But I just want us to talk about breathing again. Because I feel like everybody in here is not breathing because we're so scared about what this next year is going to be like. And I want us to basically take down our guard and have a conversation. One of the things I learned from Abe Maslow, not in person, of course, because I was 10 when he died, but his family gave me his diaries for the last 10 years of his life. I don't have the only copy. There's 100 sets, 2-volume sets, so I'm one of 100 people who have them. But late in his life, he used to use an expression that I don't think he ever used in any of his books called psycho-hygiene. Psycho-hygiene. And that, in retrospect, I didn't know it at the time. You know, our wisdom is something that just comes naturally, not because we're scripted. And that's what I did in Santa Cruz. I used psycho-hygiene. And what is psycho-hygiene? It basically means that when you're faced as a leader with a collection of people who are sweating their life and stressed and almost like in a sauna together, what you need to do is create a catharsis, a collective bathing experience that allows people to start breathing again and to feel like they're okay and to feel like they can connect with others. Because anxiety does create this sense of people feeling like they have to put an armor jacket on. So that's what we did. And oh my God, that 60 to 90 minutes, of all 24 years of being a CEO of my company, that 60 to 90 minutes is the biggest highlight of my life as a leader, because people came and they cried and they expressed their sense of mission and meaning about what the company is about, and their fear that they were going to get fired because they know their budget that they just gave as a general manager to the owners of the hotel in most of our hotels we don't own, they weren't going to make. They just knew. In fact, 2009 was an awful year for the hotel business. But the budgets we had just turned in, because we knew our owners had to approve the budgets and they were not going to approve a 20% drop in revenues next year, which is what happened, they just knew that it was going to be a tough year. So I guess I learned the lesson, speaking of compassion, which is what we're supposed to talk about, I learned about compassion on stage because I knew what fear did to me. And I don't think fear took me flatline. I think there's a biological thing going on in my body related to the antibiotics. But I know that it paralyzed me emotionally in all kinds of ways. And I could feel that being able to not judge myself for what I was going through and to feel it was allowing me to actually feel it for the people in that room. And when we think about compassion, a lot of times we actually don't think about it in the context of our work or business. In fact, especially leaders in businesses, you don't think that way. We don't tend to talk that way. But actually, that's what I felt at that moment, as I felt, I'm going to cry. I felt an intense amount of compassion for the people in that room some of whom had worked for me for 20 years, who they had gone to the base of Maslow's pyramid, and they didn't want to be there. They had gone to that survival place because they thought they were going to get fired potentially, and that their families would be at risk, and their kids in college would be at risk, and their mortgages would be at risk. And they'd spent the last few years with us in the company focusing on the meaning piece at the top of the pyramid and knowing that they loved that. Thank you. And they didn't want to be at the bottom of the pyramid. And now I know. I mean, in the moment, I did this in 5 minutes' time. I threw away a speech, and I did this in 5 minutes' time. What I know is that that's what I was helping them do. I was helping them saying, okay, we're going to secure the bottom of the pyramid. We are in this together, and let's figure out how we can be back up, higher up on that pyramid, how we can find meaning in this moment, because despair equals suffering minus meaning. And if meaning is 0, the way the equation works is despair equals suffering. And that's, I think, what people were feeling. So,
well, it's interesting, though, because I think, though, you would acknowledge that, sometimes what, quote-unquote, leaders do is they try either to sugarcoat the truth or hide reality in the hopes that either they won't ever have to face it, they won't be held responsible, or if they put their head in the sand deep enough, it'll all go away. And I think, and maybe you can tell me your thoughts on this, everyone understands that life is not perfect, that it's going to have its ups and downs. People just want to be treated with transparency.
Yeah, listen, after Emotional Equations came out, I did a lot of interviews, lots of stuff, and at one point I said, I think the best leaders are vulnerable visionaries. And I like the alliteration of it, and what I meant by that is, if you're too much of one or the other, it's a little bit problematic. But being vulnerable as a leader and still having confidence and inspiring confidence allows people to take off the flak jacket and to talk about what they don't know, and actually even talk about what's not working. And that's important. And then the visionary piece is really the speaking of where we are right now is awful, but here's the vision I see of where we can get to. Here's the roadmap. It can't just be sort of like vision, like this magical thinking, and there's not really a plan for how to get there. But if you can be enough confident and visionary enough about where we can go, was it Nietzsche who said, you can deal with any, someone help me here. You can deal with something, I don't remember. It's a great quote.
If it doesn't kill me, it makes me stronger.
Well, it doesn't kill, it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger, and it's sort of like you can deal with any kind of something if you don't, I don't know. The long story short is, if you can, it's back to Frankl and the concentration camp and meaning. If you can feel that meaning and the why, it's really coming down like, why am I here? Why do I live? What is this experience supposed to be for me? That helps you to get through some very difficult times. So, yeah, so that was great. I mean, it was a great experience, and it really helped people come into the year with a place of like, okay, Let's be transparent. And because how leaders are the emotional thermostats of the groups that they lead. Wherever I set my temperature is where other people are going to set the temperature, which is why in April, when Chip committed suicide, I was so challenged because I was the CEO of a company and people were everybody could see the business was falling apart again, like the dot-com bust. And during the dot-com bust, due to Abe Maslow's help, at least with his books, I was able to become a gladiator and really help people. I mean, it wasn't just being the gladiator, but it was really help people to sort of have confidence and have the vulnerability. But what I felt in April of 2008 was all the vulnerability and none of the vision, and certainly none of the passion to be in the position I was in anymore. And I felt way under the microscope. So, yeah, so that's ultimately, one of the things I help people with now a little bit. I don't coach, I don't have time to do that, but I do help just as a friend of people, and just when people ask, I help people get out of the handcuffs that they feel in an identity that's self-imposed, as well as an identity that's, other people have of them, that quite often is in a CEO role or entrepreneur role where they have outgrown that role and they're not supposed to be doing it anymore, and yet they feel that sense of responsibility or the sense of fear of not knowing another way to be in the world. And that's why some of these people who committed suicide, my friends, committed suicide. Their identity was this. And meaning their company, and when their company went down, their sense of identity went down, and they didn't know how to get out of it.
What a wonderful, bright topic now we've switched to.
Well, let's talk about festivals.
I
want to talk about festivals.
Let's go to festivals.
And then I want to let other people talk.
We're good. We have 4 minutes.
Okay.
So,
So fast forward, you didn't finish the story. I was in February last year. I was in New York. The emotional equations had done well. I was giving a speech to about 600 people, and at the end of the speech, the first person who asked the question said, "That was all good about that emotional equations and emotional intelligence stuff, but that's not my question, Chip. I've been studying you. I'm not your stalker, but here's what I know about you. I know your favorite place in the world is Bali, and you've been there a dozen times. And I know that you're on the board of Burning Man, the arts festival." She says, "I love Bali and Burning Man. Why do we love Bali and Burning Man?" It's like, wow, in front of 600 people in New York, I had to answer that question. And so for 5 minutes, I sort of riffed, and I just got to a place where I ultimately said, I want to become the world's leading expert on festivals, because Bali is just one endless festival. And it's a village celebrations and that sense of collective effervescence, to use a Emil Durkheim phrase from 100 years ago, a sociologist. Collective effervescence, how we, especially in the digital age, in an era where in humankind, we've had festivals going back to the time when we were, had sun gods and we were praying to the pagan sun gods. And it's more necessary today than ever because we're so, on these computers and on these laptops and our little digital devices and our phones. And the more digital we get, the more social ritual we need. And so I said all this on stage, and I said, you know what I've noticed? Because I'm on a Burning Man board, and I've gone to all these festivals in the world. There is no website that shows the world's best festivals of all kinds. Arts, cultural, religious pilgrimages, spiritual, wacky and wild, crazy ones, parties. There's not a festival, there's not a website that has all of the best festivals and then matches you to the festivals that fit your personality and your identity and how you see yourself. I said, I want to do that. And then, it was like, all of a sudden, half the audience said, wow. Yeah. So long story short is I'm launching a website in June called Fest 300. It's the 300 best festivals in the world. And it's not, it's a little bit indulgent, like going around all these festivals. I love that. But the purpose is it goes back to what we started with, the other. How I went to the Whirling Dervish Festival in Konya, Turkey, to celebrate Rumi's death. They call Rumi's death in Turkey his wedding day. And those of us in the US don't really get to see the full range of what Islam has to offer. And my personal trainer, who I work out with for the last 5 years is Muslim and very good friend. And he's a Sufi, and Rumi was a Sufi. And for those of you who don't know Rumi, he's a poet and philosopher. And if you don't know Rumi and you live in the Bay Area, what rock are you living under? Especially if you're at a compassion thing. So long story short is, I decided to go to the Whirling Dervish Festival in Konya, Turkey, thinking I'd be like hanging out with a bunch of people from Mill Valley. And no, in fact, there were maybe out of 100,000 people at the festival, there were about 5 Americans. And it was the best experience of my life. Not because there were only 5 Americans, but because I really got to experience Sufi Muslim life at a Whirling Dervish Festival for 10 days to celebrate the fact that Rumi was the first Whirling Dervish, and he died 739 years ago. And for every year, since then, they've done a Whirling Dervish Festival. That's what the festival website is going to introduce people to, is the fact that there are opportunities to experience collective effervescence with the other, someone who's different than you, that will help you to understand that the world is full of sacred experiences and sacred people who are different than you. And that's what my high school taught me. And so that's all I'm going to say.
The curious white boy.
Yeah, the curious white boy. Yes, that's me. So thank you.
Before we entertain questions, I'm going to do 3 things. Please come up to the mic if you do have a question. The first is Esalen has started a leadership thing, and actually they're going to have an event at Stanford here, and you can sign up. The other thing for those who are interested, there's actually a Compassionate Society Index that a guy at the university named Tom Anderson, University of Minnesota, he's now emeritus, but there are, I think, 28 indices that define a country as compassionate. So if you're interested in this, you may want to take a look at that. So without further ado, why don't we start with some questions?
Okay, I just wanted to ask to get a little more detail on how you were going to choose those festivals. And you said the collective effervescence, but could you just give a little more detail on that?
Sure. So the website's called Fest 300. If you go there now, you'll just see my travel blog of experiencing festivals. So this winter, I went to 5 weeks in Europe, 5 different festivals. Like I went to Kumbh Mela in India, 100 million people in a festival, 30 million on the peak day. It's a 55-day-long festival. Stunning.
Yep.
So first of all, it's like a curator in a museum. The curator in a museum doesn't necessarily pick the absolute 300 best pieces of art to put on their walls. They try to create a collage or a collection that helps to have enough diversity in it to show all kinds of festivals. So there'll be probably no more than about 10% of the festivals will be US festivals. While most of the people probably initially who are looking at the site will be probably Americans, United States folks. It's across a variety of different cultures, across different types of festivals. There'll be some film festivals, there'll be some music festivals, there'll be sort of some transformational New Age festivals, but there'll be across a whole collection. How do we determine like how you make it? We have 5 of us. And we're going to have our own little voting process between the 5 of us. But ultimately, 10% of the festivals, the last 30 of the 300, will be crowdsourced. And so later, like at the end of the year, we'll do a crowdsourcing thing on that. But we have some, it's pretty technical talking about the 14 different components that actually we are using to define it. But let me just say, there's some specific things. If you want to ask, if you're a festival producer and you want to ask things later, feel free to come up later and you can ask me some of the more specifics. Well, ultimately for me, collective effervescence, how it creates collective effervescence, whether it's an intimate collective effervescence, there's a festival in the Andes called Corto Riti, which is before the Inti Raymi festival, which is the sun god festival in Peru. And Corto Riti is at 15,000 feet. It's a combination Catholic and pagan festival with a few thousand people in it. And it's stunning. That's a festival that may make it. It's a small festival, and I don't want to overwhelm them, but I know from that experience that the collective effervescence there is like off the charts at 15,000 feet with the nature of what goes on there. So we want to actually introduce people to festivals that they might not know about otherwise. We will have Mardi Gras in New Orleans as well, because we want to make sure we've got some of the better known ones as as well.
First of all, thank you for coming. I'd like to ask you a question. Digging into your past, you mentioned that you were Stanford undergrad plus business school, so I wanted to hear more about kind of how you decided to pursue the business school path and why you think you got in straight out of undergrad when that's, was very rare when you were going to school and even rarer now.
Yeah. Well, it was rare. I was the only one who went straight in from Stanford, and I took almost a year off from undergrad. I came in with some extra AP credits, and so I was able to graduate on time and still take almost a year off and work. So I actually had some work experience. I took 4 classes at the business school, 4 courses as an undergrad, and in each case you have to petition to the professor to be allowed in, so I had to convince the professor, 4 different professors, and I did that as an undergrad. Now this was during my Stephen Townsend Conley Jr. period, when I was very ambitious, trying to be the junior version of my dad, and or actually more frankly, the junior division of my dad, what my dad wanted me to be. And so I think that I was extremely focused and ambitious, and I'd proven myself that I'd actually done well in those 4 courses as an undergrad, and I had taken some time off. So I think that helped.
You.
Yeah.
So thank you for reminding me of Kumbh Mela. That was my transformational journey.
India is the number, so if you had to, India is the #1 country in the world for festivals. If there's a gold, a silver, and a bronze, India gets the gold, Spain gets the silver, and you'll be surprised, Japan gets the bronze, but interesting.
So I have a good excuse. I see my mom every year in India, and I go to some festival every year. But
this weekend, by the way, Holi here at Stanford.
Stanford is
Holi
amazing.
was in India last week, but it's Stanford Holi Festival. Okay, sorry.
So my question is this. I've been trying very hard because my friends who are in their 40s and 50s, mostly men, have the same issue. They identify so strongly with their career, and they go up and down with the career. I went through that during the dot-com up and then the dot-bomb down, and finally ended up at Kumbh Mela to recover. So my question is, is there any way you can even recommend or suggest to these people, go from this identity that you're locked up in this.
This what? Say that again.
Your identity is totally locked up in
yes.
career to expand into that collective effervescence. I had a hard time convincing myself. It took me like 7-8 years. And I'm wondering how I can help others, if at all possible.
Well, yeah, that's a really great question and a hard one to answer in 2 or 3 minutes, but let me just try. Well, first of all, you have to realize you have the problem. and the problem being connecting your sense of identity with your work and your identity and your ambition and your performance. And once you can actually see that and maybe have a sense of humor about it, part of it is, for me, what it was to go on a spiritual path. It was learning meditation. It was learning how to realize that the person that I most want to be in the world is not the most successful, performance-driven person. What I realized, and what's very true, and what the Bhutanese can teach us, is that the way our mind works is whatever I have as an ambition, as soon as I get it, it's only half as good. And then there's something else that's the new finish line. And it's classic, and there's lots of psychology research that's been shown about this. And it's part of the treadmill that America runs on. It's very much the treadmill that MBAs run on. And so once I could see that pattern and many things that I had succeeded at and gotten what I wanted, and then all of a sudden, and we do this with relationships and marriages, and you feel it on your honeymoon. Once I realized that there is the trickster in my mind doing that with me, it really helped me to see how many other things in my life would give me a more full-bodied life that I didn't want to mortgage. At the end of the day, last thing I'll say is Henry David Thoreau has a quote. I've had it written on my mirror for 30 years now, 25 years now. The cost of something is measured by how much life you have to give for it. And what we don't do a good job of in business schools and in the United States is to help people measure the cost of workaholism and obsessive performance mentality. And if anybody knows the Enneagram, I'm a 3 on the Enneagram. And so this is classic for my type. And once I could actually learn a little bit more about what my type was and read some Enneagram books, it really helped me to unlock myself from those handcuffs. Yes.
Thank you for being here. It's a two-part question I have. One is, if you could maybe briefly speak about how you evolved since your day at that hospital where you requested the briefcase.
Yeah.
Maybe in phases, along with what helped you transgress one phase to the next phase to the next phase. And the second part question would be for CCARE as well as you, if there's any such program that is kind of formalized for people like you in 2009,
yeah,
that they could join and maybe in the care or in the wisdom of the people running the program, that they could actually maybe get to a better state. Because it seemed to me from what you discussed today that you were all by yourself and you had this book. And I don't really think that that's really a lot of ammunition for somebody in your position.
Yes. So the first question was, how did I go over the stages? Well, first of all, the good news for me was I knew I didn't want to be CEO anymore. And in fact, that's the first step, and a lot of people don't get it. They realize that they have this malaise or this apathy, or they're angry a lot, or they're just sort of anxious. And they don't even actually realize that what used to be their calling and the thing they thought they loved doing, and they did probably love doing, they don't love doing anymore. And it happens all the time. And then and if you're the CEO of a company that you own, it's like, okay, well, what am I going to do? I can't go float my resume and get another job. So, but for me, I was very clear I liked the writing, speaking thing, and that was going to be my path to whatever was next. And so I just had to figure out how to functionally get the company to a new place. For me, it wasn't necessarily too many phases of thinking, okay, now I figured out I'm not supposed to be doing this anymore. The flatline experience said to me, if I don't do this soon, I will die, and I might I might do it myself. I might jump off the bridge. And so once I got to that place and saw what that meant, it meant I accelerated my path of getting out of there. In terms of what resources are available, I was luckily in a program or in an organization called YPO, Young Presidents Organization. And so once a month, I would sit down with our chapter had 45, 50 people in it, but my group in my forum was 7 of us. And once a month, I would meet with them, and we'd spend 4 to 5 hours, all CEOs, all talking about what wasn't working. That's generally what was going on. And it was that group of people who generally were people who usually had their armor on when they were at work, would take it off, and I was able to be honest enough to say, they also knew before I had my flatline experience, I had said a month earlier, I want cancer or a car crash. I said it amongst these 7 people, 6 other people. I said, I want cancer or a car crash because I need an escape. And then I broke my ankle, and then I had my flatline experience. So those guys held, and one woman, Amy Errett, they held my hand through a really difficult time. In terms of what resources are available, there needs to be more. There's a lot of people who've said, Chip, you just need to create an institute or something like that, but I thought I was going to do that. And when I said my festival thing a year ago in New York, the very next day I was with my literary agent, and he said, well, this emotional equation book was so good. I think you should become the world's leading expert on men and anxiety. And in that very moment, I said, you know what? I was on stage yesterday, and I said I want to become the world's leading expert on festivals. And that's what I really want to do. And that's my calling, I think. And so I feel badly that I haven't, my book shared it. I go out and talk about it a lot. There is a conference every year called FailCon, which is a Silicon Valley conference about people learning how to deal with failure. And I keynoted that conference this last fall. So I'm an advocate speaking about it, but I haven't been able to get in the trenches to sort of work on it. But I do get lots of emails every week from people who are in that situation, and I answer every email. So if there's somebody in this room who feels that way, you go to chip@chipconley.com and just email me, and I'll try to talk you through whatever you're going through.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Chip. Good to meet you in person. First off, I'm a little terrified standing here. So
What's your name?
My name's Star.
Hi.
Star.
So I have two inquiries. One is about the festivals, and being an explorer, there's such a patina that I enjoy going to festivals and traveling. And my concern is, as you make it more mainstream, as you've seen with Burning Man, what it was in the beginning and what it is now, it's going to change the patina and change the entire environment.
Yeah, totally agree.
So what do you say to that?
So there are festivals that we're not going to have on our Fest 300 list. I mean, the truth is, I mean, to think that my little website is going to actually have that kind of impact is, you know, I hope it's the case. But no, I don't think it's going to be that big that it's going to have that kind of effect. But we won't do festivals. We won't list festivals that are 2,000 or 3,000 people or less. So, and we're going to talk, some of these festivals are quite rustic, exotic places. They're not that easy to get to. I guess part of that will be a function of once we get it up and the website's up, if we start to see some backlash, or if we have producers of a festival who said, we really don't want to be up there, I'll take it down in a second and we'll add someone else instead because there's a lot of other festivals that would like to be there. So that's what we'll do. We'll see sort of by trial and error. So that's all I can say. Yeah, you know what? You know a festival's actually probably either on the wrong or the right path if people say it isn't like it used to be. And what it usually means is the festival's gotten so popular and maybe in some cases so good that people love it so much that there a lot of other people have found out about it. But there's no doubt that what was once a little, you know, small gathering, when it gets bigger, has a different experience. I'm sure that's true. It's not just true of Burning Man with its 60,000 people. It's true of Kumbh Mela over thousands, you know, of years. So.
And then I had another question. I've recently come out of a very difficult work situation, and they, a larger corporation, and they did have structures as far as every year we were able to fill out feedback on our management.
Yeah.
And so when we were taken in by this corporation, we were very excited about being able to have our voices heard. And truly, you know, I'm a massage therapist. That's the best work ever. So
I agree.
If you need to take somebody on your trips, I'm happy to do
Yeah.
that.
Listen, I trained at Esalen in massage therapy 28 years ago.
So, you know, we were very excited about having the potential of positive change to happen.
Sure.
And so the first year, this director got 17% in listening skills and 22% in whether or not we trusted her. Mm-hmm. And those scores over the past 5 years have improved, but they still waver around, you know, 15, 60%.
So what's your question?
So what would you suggest for the people in the lower places? Like, how do we make change when we're doing the feedback and we're going to HR and we're doing this? How do we make?
Yeah, no, I mean, in some cases, you know, certain situations and certain relationships are not meant to be, and whether that relationship is you and the company or you and your direct boss, the number one reason people leave their job in America is not because of money. In fact, money is the fourth place. The number one reason people leave their job in America is because of their boss. So how else could you do it? If it's somebody who's not too defensive and might be slightly open, doesn't sound like it based upon her scores, but you know, your last stab before you would leave the job, potentially if you had to, would be to say, let's go have lunch. And what you could say it from the perspective of, I would love to have a reciprocal lunch conversation about how you think I could be better in the job, and are you open to having the conversation of me giving you some feedback on how I think you could be better. That's a very hard thing to say to someone who's your boss, especially when you know some of what you're going to say is not things that they want to hear. But I got to tell you, I had an experience like that 15 years ago when our head of marketing took me out and said something like that to me, and I needed to hear it. And he told me what I didn't want to hear, but I needed to hear, and I became a better boss as a result. That doesn't mean it will happen in your case, but you could try that. You could also do the classic thing, which is go around them and go and talk, you know, you talk to their boss, talk to HR, Personally, I have rarely seen that is as effective as actually going directly to the person.
I think this is unfortunately going to have to be our last question. And
we got
of course,
Phil.
No, I mean, Phil has to be the last question.
Okay.
I would never
In fact, for those of you who might not know, Phil recently celebrated his 80th birthday.
Yay.
Anyway, before I ask my difficult question, I want to thank you, perhaps on behalf of the audience, for an insightful, inspirational, and entertaining dialogue.
Thank you.
Before the difficult question, which is about bullies in the workplace, perhaps there's a festival you might not know about. It's in my native Sicily. It happens on every Easter weekend, where everyone in the town dresses up as an angel or a devil, everyone. And it's the battle of good versus evil. It's in the mountain town of Prezi, whose claim to fame was where Frank Sinatra's father was born.
Wow.
So I would recommend.
Thank you.
I would recommend this. I'll send you pictures of it.
Send me pictures. I love it.
Okay. So the big problem is,
Yes.
how can we teach compassion to bullies? Now, bullies are a problem, have been a problem in all of our schools, and bullies do two things. They create victims, and that's unfair, but the bigger problem is they create bystanders, every one of us who knows it's going on and does nothing. Okay? The problem is bullies grow up, and now they're in the workplace where they have real power. They're foremen, they're managers, and a recent article, I guess, in the Wall Street Journal said bullies reduce profits by 10% because the people who are bullied call in sick, they transfer.
Less engaged. Right.
So the question is, for each of you, how could we teach compassion to bullies to get them to stop being bullies?
Okay. You want to go first or second?
I'll go second.
Okay.
Because I want to hear what you have to say, and then I'm going to pipe in and go, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Well, my personal experience is that bullies fall into two categories. And the majority of them are people who, while they don't look like it on the outside, are bullying themselves, or they have a history of being bullied themselves. And my father, in some ways, was a bully, lovable in many ways, and over time, much less of a bully. But he's got a very, he's a very boss, aggressive kind of guy. He got a big temper. So if we've grown up or had experiences where you are being bullied, and that's what the leader or the boss does to you, you sort of emulate that. And I've seen over and over again is that people like that internalize it as well without even noticing it. They don't realize how judgmental and difficult and bullying they are to themselves. And they've felt, frankly, that's what's made them successful and effective in life. And for some of these people, and I've had a handful of bullies who have worked in our company, when you shine the light on how their bullyism, their bully behavior, is actually ineffective and will make them unsuccessful, it was a step in a direction that helps them realize that this habitual behavior and ritualized behavior that's sometimes very familial from their family is actually not going to allow them to be as effective and successful. And that's for one type of person. For another kind of person, you actually start showing the behavior and how it really is caustic and toxic. And you might get through their emotional side. A lot of times you don't. One of the ways we did it functionally, like a literal actual tool that helped us, was historically we judged people, or I'm sorry, judged is the wrong word. We evaluated people in terms of performance based upon, it was based upon performance, but it was sort of tangible financial performance and certain other metrics. What we started to do is we started to look at results, those kind of results, and relationships. And we had a 4x4 grid. And every single manager in the company was evaluated by their peers and by the people who worked for them, the people who worked with them, and the people who worked above them on results and relationships. The results piece was sort of evident because it was like there were like 8 different metrics. The relationship, half of the relationship piece was metric 2, so it was what do work climate surveys say about your boss. What do the exit surveys show about the people who've left the company? One of the best things you can do is do exit surveys with people who are leaving, because once they're leaving, they'll tell you how much they hate their boss. They won't tell you before then. So exit surveys helped a lot. And so we kept track of that. And a few other things. And what we found is what we said is you cannot grow in the company unless you are in quadrant 1. There's 4 quadrants, 16 boxes, 4 by 4. So 1 to 4 on results, 1 to 4 on relationships. If you were a 1 on results, but a 3 on relationships, you were not in quadrant 1. You're only in quadrant 1 if you're a 1 or 2 on results or a 1 or 2 on relationships. And once we instituted that and put it in place, there was a woman who was the most effective short-term results-oriented manager in the company, general manager of a hotel in the company. She would get amazing short-term results. And you can always do that by charging way too much money to the customers so they're pissed off, and cutting back on staff so much so they're pissed off. But the financials look spectacular in the short term. She was great at that. She would score a 1 on results. When we put this thing in place, she was a 1 on results and a 4 on relationships. And she did not get, at some point, she ultimately lost her job, but she didn't get any promotion in the company for 3 or 4 years, and she'd grown fast. She'd grown fast because she'd get things so good, and within 18 months, we'd move her somewhere else, and then the people who actually had hated her was like, oh, ding dong, the witch is dead. And she'd moved on. And nobody was coming forward to say, okay, well, I guess they promote those kind of people in the company. So last thought is the other kind of bully is the psychopath, sociopath bully who will never understand that their own effectiveness and performance will get better if they're less of a bully. And they will not ever, you'll never get through to them on the emotional side of the toxic effect of bullying. Because we've done a bully session where we had a manager in a room with 8 of their subordinates, people who worked for them, and with 2 people in HR, and 2 hours of tears. And that particular manager got it. Because we knew with that manager that they had enough emotional awareness to just realize that they had a habitual thing that wasn't working for them. They were less focused on the performance side. They just realized that they were being toxic. But there are some bullies who are not going to be that way. And those are the ones you have to fire like as fast as you can. I'm sorry. Because those are the ones where the amount of energy and time that's going to go into actually trying to fix them is never going to solve it. So, and you should not use that word when you talk. When you can just.
I've never used that word actually.
Sorry about that.
Just a comment on not necessarily the use of that word. It's interesting because when we talk about sort of how people can benefit from compassion, I would say there's this bell-shaped curve, and most of us stand in the middle with the reality that all of us can improve us in the middle, because very few of us are so self-actualized that we're the Dalai Lama or whatever person you want to put in that category. And then on the other side of the group of people which are the ones you're talking about, there's no reason to expend any energy because you have absolutely no ability to give them insight, to make them emotionally aware, to make them have insight into how their behaviors have impacts on people, because they don't care. They do not have functionally any ability to have insight into the emotions of other people. But I would say, just regarding my own experience with bullies in a variety of times in my life, frankly, for so many of these people, they're really in pain. It's not like somebody wakes up and I'm a bully. What happens is they're battered and bruised, and oftentimes they have no protector. And then the only thing they know is that's how you deal with things. And one analogy potentially is, you look at a spouse who's domestically abused. You go, how can you keep going back to that? Well, if that's all you know, and for a lot of people, the fallback position of how we react, and even in our lives, is how we've grown up with and the defense mechanisms we use in our lives to survive. And those survival skills whether good or bad, oftentimes stay with you. And it's really how do you give people who have the ability to change the insight into that. But on that note, thank you all so much. It's always a pleasure. Chip, a dear, wonderful person, as you all see. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.